I'm always astonished when I see hummingbirds by their wings and how fast they beat, that the air even hums, and that they can hover and fly backwards. And also, I'm always struck by how tiny they are. I mean, they're really small, little creatures, and yet they've also been on this planet, part of the Earth, for over 20 million years. These have long lived and long evolved creatures. And yet you have to sort of look for them. They're hard to see unless you have a hummingbird feeder and pay attention. Despite all their bright colorfulness, they're hard to notice. And hummingbirds, their specialty is drinking nectar and pollinating plants. So whether we notice them or not, they're busy doing that work as part of the ecosystem, pollinating plants and keeping them healthy, keeping the system healthy. They're small and mighty little birds. And I think Unitarian Universalism is a small and mighty religion. We're a tiny group of people here in Canada, hummingbird sized compared to Christianity or Islam or Hinduism, even compared to Unitarian Universalism in the US. And I think we still have a role to play, small though we are, in the Canadian ecosystem. We pollinate the flower of culture shift. We quietly and busily fly around, doing strange things like fly backwards, and we hover and focus, encouraging ideas like women being real people who can be ministers, ideas like Black Americans have the right to vote and be educated without segregation, ideas like the LGBTQ plus community have the right to love, the right to marry. We are pollinators of cultural change, and we're by no means the only ones, but we do push religious boundaries wider like no other tradition. And I believe we're finding ourselves at a change moment again. A moment that reminds us that racism didn't end with the end of segregation, that says cultural change has to happen both internally and externally, and that the systems have to change. And this moment is asking white people to listen, to truly listen to Black, Indigenous, all people of color when they say there's still racism, and that racism is right here in Canada and in our congregations. 2 weeks ago, the Canadian Unitarian Council's Dismantling Racism Study Group, DRSG, a team of mighty little hummingbirds, released their final report based on a survey of over 800 Canadian UUs. And our members, Charmaine Furwarn and former DLL Pamela Smith-Luters, are part of that Dismantling Racism Study Group. And their report makes it clear that we do, in many ways, embody white supremacy culture. And that's a culture that's shaped by perfectionism, a sense of urgency, individualism, and the idea that progress is bigger, better, more. And the report tells us that BIPOC respondents have experienced racist comments and behaviors within UU communities, while some of the white respondents noted things like, I don't really see racism happening in our church. And that's part of the problem, because if you can't see the racism, you can't name it, and you can't change it. The DRSG report says that people of the chalice, we have our work to do on issues of racial justice and equity. And we need to do that work so we can be as radically inclusive as we aspire to be, so that we can create that beloved community of interdependence, love, and justice that we seek as Canadian UUs. Now, I know it's not easy to hear this. Over the years, I know I've certainly gone through stages of denial and defensiveness when I hear about white supremacy culture. And I'll note that defensiveness is another trait of that kind of culture. And there's certainly been periods in my life when I've been fervent about the joys of multicultural Canada, where we happily eat samosas and watch Kim's Convenience and cheer on the Toronto Raptors and have diversity without racism. But then I did a course called Racism for White People and another on deep diversity. And we did the truth and reconciliation work here, and we did our nurturing inclusivity work. And I've gone to lectures by people like Desmond Cole and listened to the podcasts and read books and followed Black people and other people of color on Twitter. And over time, I've gone, oh yes, of course. Racism is everywhere. It can't not be. It's embedded in the DNA of Canadian society in North America and how we formed and came to be. From the land stolen from the Mississaugas of the credit, the fur trade, the slave, the sugar and rum trade that made Europeans and North American settlers rich, to today and the advantages of white skin that has allowed me to make my choices with very few barriers in the way. Just the fact that I can be white for so many years without ever really thinking about it. That's white supremacy culture. We're the fish swimming in water saying, what's water? It's just how our society was formed. And it takes time, and I've really had to think through unhooking that term white supremacy from the Ku Klux Klan and understanding it as a way to name a culture designed by white people for white people. And that doesn't make me evil. It doesn't make society evil. Living in this racist society, having it embedded in me as I am embedded in it, doesn't make me a bad person. It just makes me a human being. We're all in this together. We're all in this culture together. And now that I know better, I can do better, as Maya Angelou says. I can choose to be a hummingbird and pollinate the shifts of cultural change. So the report from the Dismantling Racism Study Group asks that makes a number of recommendations, including asking UUs to listen to the voices of Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color, because they've actually been here and part of our communities all the time, and they've been waiting a long time to really be heard. And the report says to do the work of racial justice in our congregations, we need to place it at the center of who we are. That we are radically inclusive people of the chalice. We believe we are all connected and that our actions matter. And so as we go forward, there's concrete things we can do, like make anti-racism training a requirement for board members and committee chairs. We can teach anti-racist curricula for our kids as well as the adults. These are all strategies that we can do to help us shift towards that inclusive, beloved community we seek. And it's going to be messy, and we'll make mistakes and we'll be wrong, and that's okay. Because we're moving away from needing to be right and perfect and into living beloved community. And life is complicated and messy and goes back and forth, and that's how it is, and that's okay. Our world is one world. What touches one affects us all. So do we believe the songs we sing? Is our world one world? When people of color are harmed by racism, we are all harmed. We are less than what we could be. And so if we want to live into our vision, our aspirations, the principles of our dearly held religion, and those of us who are white need to listen. We can start by studying the report. There's a meeting on Thursday led by Charmaine and Pamela to discuss it, and you can find the report on our website. Now, one of the recommendations of the report is for Canadian Unitarian Universalism to adopt an 8th principle. And the principle that has been put forward asks us to affirm and promote individual and communal action that accountably dismantles racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. So this principle, the 8th principle, asks us to affirm and promote individual and communal action that accountably dismantles racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. So what it's saying is our fundamental value of Unitarian Universalism is to take action against oppression. Some of you will know there was an unexpected motion from the floor at the Canadian Unitarian Council's annual business meeting to adopt the 8th principle. And it passed in the moment, but the motion has been suspended because the process was against the bylaws. It didn't give enough time for conversation and discussion. And so that motion will go back to the Canadian Unitarian Council, our national denomination, in November. And meanwhile, congregations are invited to discuss and consider the 8th principle. Now, the UCM board has decided to go one step further and has asked us to vote on adopting the 8th principle as a congregation at our annual meeting on June 6th. You'll see that in the annual report that came out on Friday. So this is a big ask and it's a big risk. The principles as they are much loved. And this is a historic shift not to be taken lightly. So I want to give you a little bit of context of how our principles have come to be and how they are continuing to evolve. So 60 years ago this month, Unitarianism and Universalism merged together. And at that time, they collectively adopted 6 principles. And then in the 1980s, those principles were revised, some significantly, some were just some word changes. And we added the 7th principle, and that happened in 1985, the 7th principle, respect for the interdependent web of which we are in part. And in fact, the sources were 5 sources at that time. And then in the 1990s, we added our 6th source about mystery and wonder of the natural world. And all of these changes were debated and caused turmoil. And yet here we stand 40 years later. And I know certainly for me and for many of you, that 7th principle is now a central tenet of our identity as Unitarian Universalism, that we are interdependent. And so we evolve. We are that living tradition that let go of creed and dogma to open the circle wider. And now we're continuing. We're part of that process still to continue to clarify and evolve our UU values and our theological framework. We're young in many ways, 60 years old. And so we've been asked to widen the circle clearly and explicitly with the 8th principle, to see anti-racism work not just as a social justice project, but as essential to our identity as people of the chalice. And so that 8th principle reveals that we know our world is one world and that the oppression of anyone diminishes us all. And so our aspiration to be radically inclusive that we've already adopted here in Canada a few years ago means we need to do the work to widen the circle to be that diverse, hospitable community we long to be. We at UCM talk about deepening spirit, nurturing community, and acting for an equitable, sustainable world. All of these pieces tied together over and over again are saying, embedded in everything we've said, that we have this desire to dismantle racism and other oppressions. And now we're being asked to just make that explicit, to take us that next step so that we can fully embody it in the years to come. And I understand this is a big surprise. Another principle, it works like we like our 7, but that need for an 8th principle that addresses racism and other oppressions has actually been in conversation in North American Unitarian Universalism since 2013. And so in the United States, it has gone to a larger review of all the principles. And so the 8th principle is going to be part of a new revision of principles that's going to come to a vote in the States in 2 or 3 years. And Black Lives UU and Diverse Revolutionary UU Ministries Drum, which are 2 groups of people of color in the States, have endorsed the 8th principle. And many US congregations have just independently adopted it without waiting for the revisions. And that movement is happening here. So in our national vote will be in the fall. And I believe if it passes here on June 6th, I believe UC Mississauga will be the first Canadian congregation to adopt the 8th principle. And I think this is work that we are meant to do. We live in the most culturally and ethnically diverse region of all of Canada. We are the congregation of Mark Mosher de Wolf, the first openly gay minister in Canada. It feels like this is a place for us to be hummingbirds and pollinate that change of cultural shift in Canadian Unitarian Universalism. And I know it's a big ask because it's 2 weeks from now that we have the vote, but I ask you to take time to read that report, to read the 8th principle and sit with its words and meanings, to talk to me, to the board, to one another about it, and to attend our annual meeting and vote your conscience, holding up our 5th principle of democracy. because your voice matters. I know it's taken time for me to understand and really get my head around all of these terms and concerns and issues, and really understand what I can do to help shift this culture of white privilege and white supremacy. And I know I'm still learning, and I know we've all been learning together over the years with the truth and reconciliation work and the nurturing inclusivity work. And I know we can figure this out together. And I'm going to stay in the main room today after the service rather than go through the breakout rooms. And anyone who wants to talk about the 8th principle can stay with me. And you're also welcome to email me at any time. This is work that matters. And I believe we need this cultural change, this symbolic action that lights a beacon of hope for you people of color. It reminds them that they matter, that we want them to be here as part of our circle. Our denomination needs this shift, and so does Canadian society as a whole. What harms one harms us all. So let us be hummingbirds, small and mighty pollinators of cultural change. So say we all.